My Bible is open to Judges chapter 6. We'll be continuing in the story of Gideon there this evening. I think I misspoke last week and said that we would be finishing up Gideon this evening, but we still have a little bit of time that we need to spend with Gideon, so we won't be quite finishing him up this evening. And next Sunday will be our singing night, so we'll have a little bit of space before we finish up Gideon's story. But I do hope that you'll open up in your Bibles to Judges chapter 6. That is where we are going to be together this evening so that we can get into our God's Word with one another. It's good that we get to be together once more to get into our God's Word with one another and to sing together. Certainly the thought expressed in the song that we just sang together is such a wonderful thing to think about our desire for God and our recognition of the treasure that He is, how wonderful He is, with the same strength of a deer, of an animal who is panting for water, realizes their need for sustenance in their lives, and that we can make the recognition of comparison that is our need for God. And so to sing that together is truly a wonderful thing. To get into our lesson, there are, I think, a number of titles that this section of text can take on. In fact, I think that this title would have worked really well for last week's lesson of looking at Gideon. You will remember we looked at the faith that he displayed in spite of the fear that he had. Yes, he came and he tore down the idols by night because he was afraid, and yet he had the faith to still be given over to God. We're going to see a very similar thing carried over into this lesson, that he has the faith to act as God has given him to act, despite there being a lot of fear going on around him, that he is given over to what God has given him to do. One brother calls this section of text Trust and Obey, which I do think is an excellent title for what we see Gideon doing here, but I just didn't want to take his title. And so that being what it is, I think looking at the faith that Gideon has in the face of the fear that he is going up against, that we'll find this to be an excellent description of this part of the text as well. We're going to pick up in verse 33. I do know that verse 32 in our last lesson was kind of an awkward stopping place. Most Bibles, even with headings, are going to run verses 32 and 33 together here, all as one section of text, one block of text. And I suppose that is with good reason. But I wanted us to put this set of verses 33 through 35 with the remainder of what goes on in chapter 6 and into chapter 7, because it's going to help make a cohesive picture for us to recognize what's going on and to make a few points about some things going on in Gideon's action here. So let's pick up in verse 33. Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet them. So as we carry this back to verse 33, we find the Midianites gathering this huge army that's made up of themselves, these Amalekites, and all of these people of the east. We're not going to see this until we reach chapter 8, but if you'll turn with me to chapter 8 and verse 10 to get an idea of the size of this army that's being gathered. In chapter 8 and verse 10 we read, Now Zeba and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. And so this army that's gathered, the army that's being described in this verse, is this army that has been gathered here. And so we're looking at an army at a minimum the size of 135,000 people that have been gathered together to go to battle against Israel here. And so certainly as we talk about faith in the face of fear, this is a fearful thing to go against an army that is so large. We'll get to Israel's numbers of people into battle here in just a little while. But as we work in this part of the text, we see that the Spirit of the Lord clothes Gideon, comes down upon him as clothing, and we see that he sounds the trumpet, and his family is called out to follow him. I just word that as his family because you'll notice that as I've said all of these names, that's the first one that I've really stumbled over. I have a hard time with that Abizriite, but you will look in chapter 6 and verse 11, just previous to this, that Joash, his father, is an Abizriite. And so that being what he is, we're looking at his family here as he sounds the trumpet that is going to be following him into battle. And we see in the next verse that messengers are sent to Manasseh, the rest of this tribe of Israel, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they all go up to meet him. Now, here is really the point that I want to drive and take home here. We're about to see Gideon ask for a sign. We'll pull that up on the screen in just a moment. But when we see Gideon ask for a sign, I want us to recognize something. Gideon is not saying, Lord, unless you give me this sign, I'm not going to go into battle. He is going to say, you told me that you would give Israel into my hand. If you are going to give Israel into my hand, will you give me this sign? We're going to see him say that, and we'll talk about his faith being weak, but he is not an unbeliever. He is not one who isn't acting because God has given him a mission. You will notice the armies are being gathered. He is getting ready to go into battle. He is getting ready to do exactly what God gave him to do. He's getting ready to act faithfully to the mission that God has given to him. Is he scared? I have no doubt. He's going to demonstrate some of that fear we're going to see in this very lesson. Is he getting ready to act upon the mission that God has given to him? Absolutely. And so we need to begin in that place of understanding that even though there is this fear, even though there is perhaps a weakness of faith, we'll see that again here in just a moment, he is getting ready to act as God has given him to act. And that needs to be our starting place in properly understanding what is going on in this story. And so with that, let's think about Gideon asking for a sign, verses 36 and 37. Then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And so he does come to God, and he does say, you said that you were going to save Israel by my hand, and I'm asking you for a sign. I'm asking you to confirm your word to me. I'm going to put this fleece of wool on the ground, and if it is covered in dew and all of the ground around it is dry, I know that you're going to deliver Israel by my hand. And here's what God does. God does that. God grants the sign to Gideon, verse 38. And it was so. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. After God does this, we then come to verse 39. He's going to ask for another sign. And I think this part of verse 39 is so significant. I have included it on the screen that as he's asking for another sign, he starts off this way. Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. This is reminiscent to me of Abraham, who when he is asking for the saving of Sodom, for it to not be destroyed, he said, if there are these many righteous people, will you not destroy it? And God says, okay, if there's 50, I won't destroy it. And Abraham says, I'm not sure if there's 50. God, can I speak one more time? Please don't be angry with me. Can we lower that number? God's, okay, we'll lower that number. Abraham, can I speak again? It's very reminiscent of that thought that Gideon does know exactly who he's talking to. He does approach with knowing who God is. And he is not approaching in a way that says, look here, God, I'm really not too sure about doing this. In fact, if you don't give me this sign, I'm not going to do it. He approaches in a way that says, you are God, and I'm getting ready to do what you told me to do. The armies are being gathered. But if I could ask just one more time, please don't be angry with me. If I could ask just one more time, will you give me one more sign that I will be given the victory? And so let's read verses 39 and 40 here. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. God grants this sign to him also. Let's make the recognition. I've used these words just a few moments ago, that perhaps there is a weakness of faith here. In fact, I would say, to make that stronger, there is a weakness of faith. That Gideon, he's already been told the victory is going to be given to you. He makes that recognition in asking for the sign. He could go into battle knowing that victory is going to be given to him because God said it was going to be. And yet he asked for a sign. And then another sign to know that victory is going to be given to him. I want us to see this though. We talked about God's use of weakness the last time we looked at Gideon. That God does not need strong men. He needs men who recognize their weakness so that we will submit to God. And here's something that I want us to see at this point. God doesn't need perfect faith to use us. He needs faith to use us. You know, we might come to God with weak faith. But if it is a faith that is willing to submit to God, even as Gideon is willing to submit to God here, he's not saying, I won't go to battle. He's saying, God, my faith is weak. Please help me. Give me the strength that I need in this moment of weakness. And God gives him the strength that he needs. We're going to see Gideon's faith strengthened here, that God is able to take him from a place of weak faith and make that faith deeper as he aids Gideon along in this journey. When we get to the application screen, we're going to work on making that point further. But I want us to see that happening right here in this text, that we need to come to God in faith. And if we're weak, well, we submit to God. We give ourselves to Him, for Him to strengthen us, for Him to give us what we need to do what He has called us to do. But with that, let's continue on in this story as we come into chapter 7 and recognize that of all the armies that Israel, the peoples that Israel has gathered for their army, God's going to say, we need fewer than that. You have too many. Get rid of some of those so that I can show you that I am the one giving you the victory. Getting into verses 1 and 2. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Israel has gathered their people, and there are 32,000 of them. And God tells Gideon, that's too many people. If 32,000 Israelites go into battle, Israel's going to get the wrong idea. Israel's going to say, look how mighty of warriors we are. Look how strong we are to have won this battle. 32,000 people is way too many people. Now, I want you to remember something. We just looked in chapter 8. They're going up against 135,000 people. Last I checked, 32,000 versus 135,000. One of those is going to wipe out the other, and it's not the smaller one. And yet God says to them here, that's way too many people. If I send you into battle with that many people, you're going to think that you did it, and I need to teach you, you're not the one who did it. I am the one who is giving you the victory. So get rid of a few of those people. Verse 3. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. If you're afraid, you're trembling, go home. We don't need you in this battle. 22,000 of them leave. They're left with 10,000 people. Again, let's look at this from a human perspective. They were losing that battle when they were 32,000. Now they've been halved. They've been over half of them are gone. They've been a third there. I told you this morning, I was not a math guy. 10,000 of them are left. If there's no chance for 32,000 people to win the battle, what chance is there for 10,000 people to win the battle? Odds are not looking very good. And what does God say? That's still way too many people. If I send you into battle with 10,000 people, you're going to think you won the battle. That's still too many. And so we need to get rid of some more. Verse 4. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go with you. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. Yes. 10,000 is still too many. We're going to separate them this way. You tell them to drink this, or to get their drink of water. And those that drink in this particular way, you put them over there. Those that drink in this other way, you put them over there. The big crowd, 9,700, they were over there. The small crowd, 300, they're over here. And if I'm picking which crowd is going into battle, you know who I'm picking? I would have liked the 32,000, but if I have to pick between those two, I'm going to pick the 9,700, aren't I? You want more people going into battle. Do you know who God picked? The 300. You're going to take these 300 into battle, and I'm going to give you the victory using them. You're going to realize it's not by your strength. You send 300 men into battle against an army of thousands. It's not by your strength that you're going to win. I will give you the victory. Verse 7. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. The rest of chapter 7 is devoted to the story of Gideon, leader of this army, being given the victory over the Midianites. Let's continue on in verse 9. That same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant. Pause here for just a moment. God tells him to go down, but then he adds this phrase in here. But if you're afraid, let me give you another sign. Let's make the recognition here. Gideon didn't ask for a sign. I have no doubt that Gideon was ready to go. But as we continue on reading, we're going to see Gideon does go down just like God told him to, which tells us when God said, if you are afraid, Gideon is afraid. And do you think God knows that? Absolutely, God knows that. God is going to further deepen his faith. As he has given himself over into the service of God, God is going to make him into what he needs to be to lead the people to their salvation. Continue on with me in verse 11. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, and the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent, and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. Come back to verse 12 with me for a moment. You see that the author takes the time to tell us how large this army is before letting us know about Gideon getting down there and hearing about the dream and the interpretation of the dream. And we ask the question, why does he take the time to carefully point that out for us at this point in the text? Now, in part, some of that reasoning may be we just looked at Israel being dwindled down to these 300 people, and so we're seeing 300 go up against a massive crowd. But could it not also be to show us that Gideon sees this? Gideon recognizes this. And you know what Gideon could do in fear? He could say, look at that crowd, 300 people, there's no way. And he turns around and he heads back. But it's not what he does. He goes to where God tells him to go. And God provides this sign for him. There's a soldier there who's had a dream. And what do you know? There's also someone there to interpret that dream for Gideon to be able to hear this. That God is giving him what he needs so that his faith can be strengthened and he can carry Israel into battle. That they can be what God has called them to be. Upon hearing about this dream, let's look at what Gideon does, verse 15. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. Do you see that strengthening? Do you see that Gideon is now saying, God has given them to us? I want you to see as well. What does he do? As soon as he hears this, he worships. I think that this is a wonderful thing to recognize because the text does not put it in this order. He runs back to camp and then he worships. He runs back to a safe spot and then he worships. He hears this, that strengthening of faith, and he worships God and God's deliverance that he has given to Israel. So with this, let's continue on in the story and see how they overthrow this army. Verse 16. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars with torches inside the jars. And he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, and they held in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, A sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon. 300 men go into battle against an army of thousands. We would expect them to carry the greatest weaponry that they have available to them at the time. Whatever it may be, if they could use it as a weapon, that's what we're going to expect them to carry into battle. Now, let's think of this in the terms that we just put it. We went from 32,000 down to 300. Well, if you're going to send 300 into battle against an army that big, surely you're going to have excellent weaponry. Jars and trumpets. 300 versus 135,000. Who's going to win this battle? They surround the camp with Gideon's action. They blow the trumpets, they smash the jars, and they begin crying out the message that Gideon has given them to cry out. Who's going to win this battle? Verse 21. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zerah, and as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Bethbara and also the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Bethbara and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. What happens when 300 men do as God has directed them to do? They are given the victory. Emphasis upon that word given, because that's not how you win a battle from human wisdom. You don't surround the army with your trumpet and your glass jar and all you do is break it and yell, any more than you capture a heavily walled city by marching around it and blowing the trumpets at the end and those walls fall. God gives them the victory. The army begins to flee. In all of the confusion, the Midianite army starts fighting themselves, falling by the swords of their comrades. They are fleeing, and the people of Israel are sent for, who then pursue the Midianites. Gideon is given the victory. He submitted himself to God. In the face of fear that we can understand, you go up against that many people with 300 men. But he submits, and he is given the victory. From that, let's make a few applications. We worked on this one inside of the text, but to bring it up, we did note last time about Gideon's willingness to act, looking at the faith that acts, even though he was afraid. I want to build upon that in this lesson, that even though that faith wasn't everything that it could be built into yet, that faith was willing to act. But we need to look to God. We need to go to God. Lord, I am willing to submit to you. I'm not an unbeliever. I do believe in your word. But I need your help. Strengthen my faith. Help my unbelief, so that I can grow in my relationship with you. Give me what I need so that I can more fully put my trust in you and submit myself to you as I walk in relationship with you. We saw Gideon's faith being strengthened through these things, and God, with Gideon's willingness to submit to him, never tells him, "No, get away. I'm not going to help you in this time of need." God, you're weak. I can use weakness. I can make you strong. Your faith isn't quite where it should be yet. Well, as long as you're willing to submit to me at that point, I can strengthen you. I can make you into the person that I have called you to be. I can conform you to the image of my Son. We see that being brought out in Gideon. And we need to take that and we need to make application. Now, do not mishear my point. Do not hear me saying, well, if my faith is weak and I'm not willing to do what God has given me to do, well, that's okay. Colton says if my faith is weak, that's all right. I'll get there eventually. That's not what I said, and I've been very clear in my language to make sure that I do not push that point across. I've said every time Gideon had faith to submit to God. He was calling the armies together. He was getting ready to go into battle. He was getting ready to submit to God. Was there a weakness? Absolutely. But he was submitting to God, and from this place, God takes him to where he needs to be. And we need to make that recognition, that I can grow in my faith and in my walk with God. In this story, we see that God shows us it's Him, not us, Him by His strength that salvation is brought, that we are saved. We can stack up all of our strengths. We can take 32,000 into battle against hundreds of thousands and lose. If we're going to fight that battle upon our strength, if we think we're going to win salvation by our strength, we're not. God took 300 into battle to show Israel and to show us. You want salvation? That is by my strength. We are familiar with Ephesians 2 and verses 8 and 9, where that point is made to us. It is by grace that we are saved, by God's strength that we are saved. And in this story, to make a final application, God shows us that He saves the weak. I do want to pick up Romans 5 and verse 6 as we make this point and bring it back to the story of Gideon. I haven't been in the habit of flipping to these New Testament passages very often in making the application, but I want us to see this in this language as we bring things to a close this evening. Romans 5 and verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. I want to think about that word, weak, for a moment. Some translations will translate that word helpless. That is the concept brought out in this word, where it's saying, while we were in this position of being unable to help ourselves. I think about someone in the gym, he's trying to bench press some weight. He gets just a little bit too much, tries for one extra rep. He drops the weight on his chest. Now, we know that guy isn't actually weak. He was strong to move that weight, but he's unable to help himself. He's unable to get that weight off of his chest. And weak here is kind of similar to that. That here, while we are weak, unable to help ourselves, we just saw in the previous point, stack up all of our strength and we're not going to be able to save ourselves. And in this place of you and I being weak, of being unable to help ourselves, God says, I will help them. I will give them what they need so that they can be saved. 300 men with trumpets and jars are weak. They are unable to save themselves. You put that in any ordinary battle and they're going to be absolutely slaughtered. And they win. Do you see in Christ that here I am unable to save myself? I'm unable to bring about my salvation. But God sent him for me to save me and you. And God shows us in this story that by his power, he saves those who are unable to save themselves. It is an excellent illustration of this New Testament principle. And I think we can take that and we can see that in application to our lives. With that, we'll bring things to a close in asking the question, what does your life look like this evening? You do realize that in being helpless, unable to save yourselves, that God did send his Son to die for you. Are you living according to that reconciliation that his death bought for us? You see that as you read on in chapter 5 of Romans here. Are you living in relationship with God? Or are you living in relationship with the world? If it is with the world, you need to change that. You need to submit yourself to God. Trust in his strength and walk with him into battle, that we might know his deliverance and his salvation. If we can help you at all with that this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing the song selected?
Zion's close